Most of us have heard of the proverbial drawing board when it comes to any kind of strategic endeavor. And there's that very popular phrase, it's time to go back to the drawing board. And the idea behind that is that when one strategy fails, you can always go back and re-strategize and replan. But what a lot of people never think about is what do you do when the drawing board is already completely scribbled over and there's no more space to write any more ideas? And you don't have any more paper on which to write new ideas either. And so anytime you go back to the drawing board, there's now no more space for real strategic planning, but actually only chaos and confusion and desperation. This is sort of the situation that I believe Russia is now finding themselves in Ukraine today, where they have gone back to the drawing board many, many times. And each time they have gone back, that drawing board has become more scribbled over, to the point that today they have few and perhaps no good options left. At this point in the war, of course, we've seen several iterations of Russian macro strategy, some of which have lasted much longer than others, but nevertheless have had to be phased out for various different reasons. The first iteration of Russian strategy was, of course, the very famous blitzkrieg, which really didn't last very long, where Russia thought that they could end the war in Ukraine in a matter of literally days or weeks by putting a ton of forces into the country all at the same time, overwhelming Ukraine and capturing strategic positions before Ukraine could do anything about it, and notably taking out the Ukrainian government and replacing it with a puppet government. In hindsight, it seems that this strategy might be really the only strategy that Russia put a significant amount of thought into prior to the war. They were so confident that it would work that they didn't think too far beyond this. And what actually ended up happening was that the strategy didn't work at all. Yes, Russia was able to come into the country very quickly and temporarily capture very large swaths of Ukrainian territory, but in the process of doing this, a lot of things went wrong. A lot of things. There were, of course, the bogged down supply lines, owing largely to the lethal combination of Russian corruption and Ukrainian brilliance. It's kind of hard to execute a blitzkrieg if your units aren't actually moving forward. And that's what happened to Russia's initial strategy as they entered Ukraine and found a lot of their convoys stuck. The convoys were stuck for a number of reasons, but a big reason was the simple fact that the military vehicles kept breaking down, because a lot of these vehicles had been fitted with inferior parts, with the legitimate alternatives having been stolen and sold on the black market. The same was also true of a lot of Russian fuel. And that meant that without the proper parts and without the proper fuel, there were a lot of breakdowns that prevented Russia from moving forward. Ukraine, for their part, did their job just fine, where they executed a really brilliant strategy, hitting these convoys at the perfect moments. They would hit the front vehicle, and they would hit the rear vehicle, and leave a whole lot of vehicles stuck in between, with a lot of Russian soldiers in a panic. Which is also reflective of another reason why Russia's initial strategy failed, and that was due largely to incompetence and a lack of preparation for the actual soldiers on the ground. Many of the Russian soldiers actually said that they did not even know they were going to invade Ukraine until the moment they crossed the borders and saw the Welcome to Ukraine signs. So there are a lot of soldiers now entering very hot combat scenarios where they are not prepared mentally or perhaps in any other way to actually engage in combat. And these soldiers also, famously in the Russian military, are not really allowed to make independent decisions. There are not a lot of NCOs, non-commissioned officers in the Russian military. Everything comes from the top down. And so finding themselves in chaotic situations that they were not prepared for, the Russian military was unable to respond to the Ukrainian military that, in comparison, was very well organized and very well prepared, even though at that point in the war, they didn't have the best actual equipment. For all of these reasons and more, Russia's initial macro wartime strategy basically completely failed, or rather it was only partially successful. But when your strategy is actually blitzkrieg, where you are aiming for a very quick victory, a partial success is actually a total failure. And Russia then found themselves fighting a different kind of war that they were not actually prepared for. That becomes very significant, because when we look at all of the actual Russian gains that Russia has made, at least all the significant ones, they almost all happened during this initial period of blitzkrieg, the only time that Russia actually had a strategy that they were prepared to execute against. This is when Russia basically captured most of the Donbass region and all the territory that it currently holds today. They captured even more territory, but those gains have largely been reversed. And now Russia finds themselves today, for the last several years, having been executing a different strategy that has not been working for them at all. After their initial setbacks and reversals, Russia still felt confident that it could win, because it looked at just the basic realities of its size versus the size of Ukraine and felt that they could simply overwhelm Ukraine rather easily. And so Russia then reverted away from their initial strategy towards a different strategy that basically used Meatwave tactics. The strategy revolved around Russia's large population basically sending so many soldiers at Ukrainian positions that there would be more Russian soldiers than there would be Ukrainian ammunition. And the idea was, no matter what, we will eventually wear down and grind down Ukraine over time. And this is the strategy that Russia has now been using for most of the war. Now, a lot has been said about Russia's Meatwave tactics because this has been the primary strategy that Russia has used for the majority of the war. But what a lot of people have missed about Russia's Meatwave tactics is that this was not their original intention, but rather it was a strategy that they shifted to out of desperation. Having been locked into a different kind of war than they were prepared for, they just started basically sending everything they had against Ukraine. That framing is important because it reveals that Russia was not actually prepared for this type of warfare, and therefore they were not actually prepared to sustain this type of warfare for very long, which explains why today Russia has now been forced to kind of switch away from these Meatwave tactics, which I'll discuss in just a moment. Before we do that, though, it's important that we talk about these Meatwaves and how they have worked, or rather how they haven't worked. Because the truth is that using Meatwaves, Russia has accomplished exactly 0 major breakthroughs. All they have managed to do is grind down a couple, literally just a couple of major Ukrainian towns over a period of 3 years. When Russia initially switched to the Meatwaves, it seems that they still thought that these would bring about a rather quick resolution to the war. And the idea was, we can still win and end this war quickly. It will just be at a much higher cost than our initial strategy. That, though, turned out to be wrong, because there were a lot of things that Russia just simply wasn't prepared for. On the home front, Russia was not truly prepared for the Meatwave tactics. They weren't prepared as far as preceding that psychology into their soldiers so that they would have a willing and able body of soldiers that they could actually send on these Meatwaves, meaning that the soldiers they sent were often literally just meat, men who were deceived into going there and basically sent there without training, and that obviously made the Meatwaves less effective than if they had a propagandized population that was going there because they truly believed in the Russian cause. More than this, the Russian home front also wasn't prepared to provide enough tanks and support vehicles to actually make the Meatwaves effective. They weren't prepared in terms of not having large enough stockpiles of modern equipment, and they also weren't prepared in terms of having production capacity ready and able to replace the stockpiles as they were ground down. And so because of this, it makes it very clear that the Meatwaves were an act of desperation, where Russia thought, we probably have enough as it is, let's use what we have, we will quickly break through Ukraine and move on to the next thing. However, that didn't happen. And that didn't happen because Russia was also unprepared for something else. They were unprepared for how Ukraine themselves would actually respond, and how Ukraine has responded with largely drone warfare, basically rewriting the rules of modern warfare and flipping everything on its head. Ukrainian drones took what would have probably been very high but still manageable attrition among the Russian military and turned it into catastrophic attrition that was far more than the Russian military could actually handle. And Ukrainian drones basically made it impossible for Russian infantry to actually penetrate Ukrainian positions. But they also made it impossible for Russia to effectively use their armor, which has traditionally been the main piece of infantry assaults against another country. You have a couple $1,000 Ukrainian drone going and destroying a couple $1 million Russian tank, and they can do it very easily. They can do it routinely just as a matter of daily practice. So due to both of these aspects, Russia's Meatwaves have not actually resulted in the quick victory that Russia desperately hoped that they would after their initial strategy failed. And there is another aspect to this that makes the lack of that quick victory even more impactful to Russia. And that is the way that they have actually been supporting the recruitment needed to actually allow them to conduct these Meatwaves in the first place, which is primarily financially, by offering very large incentives to Russian recruits that volunteer to join the Russian military. These financial incentives are so large, especially as a percentage of the Russian economy, that it's very clear that Russia never saw this as a long-term strategy. Rather, they saw it as a band-aid tactic that they would use to support what they hoped would be a quick victory. That, though, because it has not turned out to be the case, means that Russia is no longer able, financially, to continue supporting the Meatwave tactics. And it means that in the very near future, Russia is going to really struggle to recruit more soldiers because they are simply running out of the money to do so. This is something that Vladimir Putin has had to basically admit to, not in as many words, but where he has had to go to the Russian people and basically tell them, we are going to lower the military budget next year because we know the high military budget is causing so many economic problems. Given all of these factors, the fact that Russia has basically completely ran out of heavy equipment, the fact that Russia is running out of soldiers, or at least running out of the money that it needs to recruit the next batch of soldiers, and the fact that Russia has not made significant battlefield progress, all of these things have forced Russia back to the drawing board. And as I've said, that drawing board is already so scribbled over that they might not actually be able to come up with another effective strategy. Russia's new strategy now seems to be moving away from the Meatwave tactics. They're still using Meatwaves here and there, but they're having no success. And so Russia has been trying out some new things on the battlefield to try to move away from that. But this is not for humanitarian reasons. It's not because Russia cares about their soldiers. Because if they really cared about their soldiers, they would have been trying these tactics before the Meatwaves, not after them. Russia's first tactic after things went haywire was to resort to the Meatwaves. And so we see that Russia is more than willing to use their men as much as possible. So when we see Russia now moving towards strategies that do not require as many men and do not require as many resources, it's not because Russia is so smart. It's not because Russia is so clever. It's not because Russia is so humanitarian, but rather it's because Russia no longer believes that they can muster enough resources to actually make the Meatwave strategy effective. Basically admitting that the last several years of warfare have been a complete waste. Something that anyone who looks at the front line can easily tell just at a glance. The problem for Russia, though, is that they are turning to their new strategy out of desperation, and the new strategy isn't working. Meaning that they're going to have to go back to the drawing board again, and there are really probably no options left for them. The new strategy is something that we have already seen tested, resulting in massive failure. And this happened near the city of Pokrovsk in a salient that made a lot of news headlines and made a lot of people very nervous. What happened was that the Russian military was able to quote-unquote sneak past the Ukrainian front lines in small units, and they were able to actually push several kilometers behind Ukrainian front lines into Ukrainian-controlled territory. And there was a lot of fear that the Russians would be able to gain a foothold, and they would be able to use this strategy to sneak through Ukrainian front lines, create salients, and then sort of cut supplies and overwhelm Ukrainian positions. What actually happened in this case was that reserve units simply came in, the front of the salient was cut off, and the reserve units came in and mopped up all the Russian soldiers that had snuck over the Ukrainian lines. There's a lot of elements to analyze here, but the most important thing to note as far as Russia's strategy going forward is that even if Russia does have the ability to get through Ukrainian front lines, that doesn't allow them to actually capitalize on that momentum and make actual durable breakthroughs. Instead, there are other aspects to the Ukrainian forces that are working as intended, namely here, the reserve units, meaning that Russia cannot effectively sneak through the Ukrainian lines to create footholds because those soldiers will be overwhelmed before they can actually get enough supplies and enough troops into the area to make use of that salient. In fact, this exact event and how everything unfolded might have actually been rather intentional by Ukraine. I've speculated before that it might have been so intentional that Ukraine may have actually tricked Russia into doing this to show Russia just how limited their options were. But even if that's not the case, the structure of the front line and how this worked is probably very intentional on the part of Ukraine, who a lot of people have speculated have limited manpower, and that's why there were gaps in the front line, but where reality is actually much different. Ukraine, of course, has a very high draft age. If they had serious manpower problems, like everybody says, they could just draft and conscript much younger men, and yet they have been hesitant to do that. In fact, they have refused to do that, showing that they don't actually think that they have the massive manpower shortages everybody thinks they have. Instead, the reason that there are gaps, quote unquote, on the Ukrainian front line is because of the nature of the war that is currently being fought, which is largely being fought with lethal tactics consisting of drones and artillery, both of which use explosives, both of which are more effective if soldiers are clustered together. And that means that the most effective way for Ukraine to hold territory at the lowest cost with the lowest loss of life and the lowest casualty rate in general is to spread their troops out more so that if there are explosions, less people are being effective. On the surface, that might look like there are gaps in the Ukrainian front line. But when Ukraine has reserve units ready and in the waiting, as we already saw here, we see that those gaps aren't actually gaps. They're actually strategic positioning with contingency plans already in place. Because of this structure and how well it works, it's actually very unlikely, in my opinion, that Russia will be able to make major breakthroughs using this type of strategy. They already tried once, they failed, that's good evidence of that. And this event in and of itself also makes future events less likely, not only because Ukraine will now be more prepared for these types of events if it was indeed an accident, but also because this has now happened, Russian soldiers are going to be less willing to capitalize on what they see as gaps in the Ukrainian front line for fear of their own loss of life. They'll be afraid that this might potentially be a trap by Ukraine, or even if it's not, once they get into Ukrainian territory, with only the weapons and food and water that they've been able to carry in with themselves, they'll be quickly cut off and they'll have no options other than to surrender or fight to the end. That's not a very good place to be in, and psychologically, it might even be worse than a Meatwave. Now, all of this becomes even more depressing if you're a Russian soldier or a Russian leader by the fact that Russia has to accomplish this not just one time. They have to break through the Ukrainian front lines not just one time, but actually several times, over and over and over and over again, because Ukraine now has several layers of defenses between their major cities and the current front lines. Up to this point in the war, none of the tactics that Russia has used have actually allowed them to have a major breakthrough on the Ukrainian front line. Not even once. At least, not since their initial blitzkrieg. The best that Russia has been able to do is to grind down individual Ukrainian towns, individual Ukrainian cities over time, where Ukrainian forces have pulled back from those positions to a new position. That is not a breakthrough of the front line. That is the front line being maintained and simply being moved back a little bit. Russia has never managed to break through the front lines. They haven't done it with Meatwave tactics, and now they're being unsuccessful with these sneaky tactics. And if both of these things are not working, you have to ask yourself, what possibly can Russia actually do next to be successful? Some people will say tactical nukes, but Russia already considered that option early in the war and decided they could not do that and survive if they did it. All in all, Russia's macro strategies are not working. They have already shifted macro strategies at least twice in this war, because the strategies they were pursuing were not working to help them actually accomplish their goals. On the flip side, Ukraine's macro strategy has essentially never changed. They've been able to continue maintaining what they're doing and only change things tactically because what they're doing is working. Ukraine has a lot of options left on the drawing board because they haven't had to go back to the drawing board as many times as Russia has. Russia has gone back to the drawing board so many times that, in my opinion, it's now completely scribbled over. And it's very clear what direction this war will ultimately go, though it will just be a matter of time. Now, if you got this far into the video, I'm guessing you obviously enjoyed this analysis and you found it insightful and you probably learned some new things. If that's the case, I'd like to ask you to help support this video by liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Both of those things are completely free, they just take a second, but they help me out a lot. And if you really enjoyed this video, you can consider supporting my work even more via several links in the description of this video by becoming a channel member or becoming a patron or via Buy Me a Coffee. I don't expect that paid support from anybody. but it really does help keep me going, and I really do appreciate all of you who work on your end to help keep me working on my end to keep producing these videos for everybody else. That said, there's a lot more to explore around just these topics. So if you want to explore more about the war in Ukraine, be sure to check out one of these videos on screen.